Have you ever felt like you were bleeding inside but without any visible wound? As if something had broken silently, where no one could see, touch, or understand? This is the longest, deepest, and loneliest pain there is, because there is no bandage for the soul. And the cruelest thing is that it almost always arises where there was trust. It arises where you least expected it, from the hands of those who promised never to let go of yours. They didn't break your bones. They broke something deeper, the invisible covenant that you would be cared for, respected, loved. And when that covenant is broken, it's not the world that falls apart. It's you, and no one sees, no one notices. You smile on the outside, but inside, you're trying to pick up the pieces of a bond that never saw you as whole. And it's exhausting, because carrying the weight of an absence requires more energy than sustaining a presence. It's at this point that something terrible happens. You start to believe you deserved it, that maybe there was something wrong with you, that maybe if you had been softer, quieter, prettier, easier, they would have stayed. You start to question yourself not because of what the other person did, but because of what you think you lacked. And it's at this point that you lose yourself, because you start to live searching for a reflection that will never come from the right mirror. The Seneca, a Stoic philosopher who faced betrayal, exile, and even death with lucidity, said that suffering arises more from our opinion of the facts than from the facts themselves. You were hurt, yes, but it's the interpretation of that wound that keeps you chained. You don't need a fresh start. You need a fresh perspective on everything you've been through. You need to learn to see your pain not as a sentence, but as a sign that something needs to change. Not in the one who hurt you, but in the one who accepted being hurt. The pain doesn't begin when the other person leaves. It begins when you stay and keep trying to convince yourself that it was love. When you try to make room for your dignity where there was only convenience. When you try to save a relationship where only you fought. Because love isn't a battlefield where one loves and the other watches. Love is reciprocity. And you hurt yourself trying to sustain alone what should be light for two. But why does it still hurt? Why, even knowing all this, do you still miss them? Because the mind doesn't just cling to the person. It clings to the promise, the idea, the hope that was nurtured. What hurts isn't the end of the relationship. It's the end of the fantasy. You're mourning everything you imagined they could be, not what they actually were. You're mourning a version of yourself that believed love was enough. But love was never enough when it wasn't mutual. And here comes the first turning point. Seneca teaches us that the free man is the one who is self-sufficient. What if you were never self-sufficient? What if your identity was built around the gaze of others? What if your self-esteem depended on the affection of others? Then yes, it will hurt. Because the downfall isn't just of the relationship. It's of the image you created of yourself through the other. It's the ruin of a version of yourself that believed love came from outside. But the truth is, you won't heal in the same place that hurt you. Expecting the same gaze that ignored you to now welcome you is to persist in a dangerous illusion. Peace isn't found by apologizing for being real with someone who only knew how to be absent. You weren't too much. They were too little. And you're still trying to diminish yourself to fit their emotional limits when, in fact, your greatness was what bothered them. There's a subtle violence that few people recognize. The violence of silence, of calculated absence, of indifference disguised as weariness. And the most brutal, you begin to blame yourself for noticing, for feeling, for asking for something basic like presence, attention, reciprocity. Seneca said, "The soul becomes what it contemplates." If you live surrounded by rejection, your soul begins to see itself as rejectable. And this distortion creates a perverse cycle where the more you seek love, the more you submit to what is not. And herein lies the urgency. You need to break this cycle. You need to free yourself from the need to be seen so you can feel real. Because your pain isn't neediness. It's overgiving where there was no return. You're not suffering because you loved too much. You're suffering because you gave yourself to someone who didn't even have themselves to offer. And no one can give what they haven't yet learned to cultivate within themselves. You don't need an answer. You don't need their excuses or explanations. You need courage. Courage to accept that you were sincere in a world of appearances. That you remained whole where many arrive already fragmented. that you felt more than you should have, not because you're weak, but because you're human. And humans who feel intensely are always the first to be hurt and the last to give up on love. They didn't destroy you. They simply revealed where you still needed to discover yourself. And yes, it hurts. But this pain, when faced head-on, transforms. It ceases to be punishment and becomes preparation. You weren't weak. You were loyal in a time of disposables. And that's not a flaw. It's rare. It's a character trait that can't be sold or taught. And this, over time, will become your greatest asset. Pain is not your enemy. It's a mirror. It shows where there's still attachment, where there's still a need for validation. It shows where you still confuse presence with value, attention with love. It shows how much you still try to be whole through other people's halves. But Seneca said, "The greatest victory is over oneself." And this victory requires vigilance, clarity, and emotional discipline. It demands that you choose day after day, not to sink into what could have been, but to blossom into what you can become. And it is this victory that now begins. Not in tears, but in decision. Not in confrontation, but in silence. Not in the answer that never came, but in the echo you decide not to listen to anymore. You don't need to prove you deserved it. You need to understand that you never had to beg for what should be natural. And that what is true will never require you to diminish yourself to remain. Your silence will now be your shield. Your absence will be your answer. And your rebirth, which begins here, will be the true answer to everything they tried to do to you. A rebirth that doesn't shout, doesn't flaunt, doesn't seek applause. It simply happens. And as it happens, it transforms everything around it. Because in the end, it wasn't them who hurt you irreversibly. It was you who believed for too long that you could only live if you were loved by someone you barely knew how to love. The truth is, you survived it, and that's strength enough. But more than that, it's a sign that you're ready. Ready to see yourself, embrace yourself, rebuild yourself. From this point on, everything changes. But not because the world will be fairer, but because you will stop begging for what has always been yours. Respect, self-love, clarity. You no longer need their presence, you need your own. And that presence, when it finally takes hold, transforms you into someone who would never return to where you were hurt. And that's the beginning of the end of pain, not because it disappears, but because you stop feeding it. Because you finally choose to care for yourself the way you've always hoped someone else would. You've bled too much inside. Now it's time to close the wound. It's time to protect yourself, not with walls, but with awareness. Not with revenge, but with lucidity. Not with words, but with distance. But one question remains. What if your biggest challenge isn't forgetting the person who hurt you, but relearning to live without pain as your companion? That's what we'll talk about next. Have you ever found yourself rehearsing a speech that will never be delivered? Mentally repeating all the words you'd like to throw in the face of the person who hurt you, as if that would somehow heal what still stings. Maybe you've even imagined that perfect conversation where the person realizes what they've done, regrets it, and becomes emotional. But the truth is, this almost never happens. Because those who hurt you, more often than not, don't see what they left in you as a wound. And that's the most consuming pain, realizing that your pain is invisible to the one who caused it. You want justice. You want the scales to balance. You want the other person to feel, even for a second, what you've felt for weeks, months, maybe even years. This is human. It's instinctive, but it's also dangerous. Because this search for emotional balance through others is a labyrinth that almost always imprisons you even further. Seneca said that true power lies in not being disturbed by the actions of others, but in mastering your reaction to them. But how do you do that when everything inside you still screams? Let's be honest. Your mind wants revenge, but your soul wants peace. And that's the silent battle raging inside you. The urge to say everything, to expose, to confront, versus the desire to simply move on. But moving on feels unfair. It feels like letting things slide. It feels like giving the other person the benefit of the doubt. And that's where you lose yourself once again. Because deep down, you're still trying to prove something. You may not even realize it, but every time you revisit the scene, every time you replay the dialogue in your head, You're trying to convince a judge who doesn't exist. You're trying to win a case in an empty courtroom. You're debating with an echo chamber, and the more you speak, the more the silence answers you. You need to understand that it's not their responsibility to understand the pain they caused. It's your responsibility to decide what you'll do with it. You can nurture it until it becomes your identity, or you can use it as building material for a new version of yourself. But as long as you're waiting for repentance, you're trapped in the illusion that healing comes from someone else. And it doesn't. Life isn't fair, and maybe it never will be. But emotional justice isn't about making someone suffer. It's about not allowing them to continue hurting you, even from a distance. And the greatest act of justice you can practice right now is to stop punishing yourself for something you didn't cause. The pain came from outside, but its permanence, that unfortunately, comes from within. A simple example. Imagine someone who has been betrayed by a lover. They were deceived, manipulated, and betrayed. But the betrayer moves on as if nothing happened. Meanwhile, the betrayed loses sleep, enters cycles of anxiety, tries to understand why, searches for answers that never come, and even after everything, they still consider sending one last message, writing a text, arranging a meeting. This is not love, it's emotional imprisonment. And the key to escaping it lies in the radical acceptance that there won't always be closure. There won't always be an explanation. And that often the absence of an answer is, in itself, the most honest answer. Silence also speaks. And sometimes what it says is, don't expect more from someone who has already given you what they could. You need to start making peace with this idea. There will be no justice the way you imagine it. There will be no confession. There will be no explicit repentance. And that's okay. Because as Seneca pointed out, the greatest injustice we can commit against ourselves is to live trying to control what is beyond our reach. What is within your reach now is simple, yet powerful. Stop fighting ghosts. Stop using your energy to try to win a war the other person doesn't even know exists. Because while you spend your days rehearsing dialogue and confrontations, they live without even remembering the script. You're living a movie alone, where the villain doesn't even watch anymore. This isn't justice, it's waste. Perhaps you need, for the first time, to abandon the idea of having the last word. Perhaps your victory lies precisely in remaining silent, in not responding, in not justifying your pain. Because sometimes silence holds the greatest answer. And believe me, nothing destabilizes someone who is expecting your collapse more than your own equilibrium. You don't need to be understood to be true. You don't need to be validated to be legitimate. What you've experienced is real. What you've felt is too. And that alone is enough to give you permission to move forward. No closure, no audience, no explanation. Just you with you. Seneca said, just because someone offended you doesn't mean you should be offended. There's something powerful about this idea, because it gives you back control, takes you out of the hostage position and puts you in the center of command. You're no longer a slave to reaction. You're master of response. And when you embrace this, something inside you changes forever. It's as if finally, you realize you're free, that you no longer need to carry that narrative, that you no longer need to explain yourself, that you no longer need to try to prove anything. You can just go. And by going, you leave behind not only the person who hurt you, but also the version of yourself that thought it needed that pain to continue existing. But of course, it's not simple. Your mind will resist. It will try to convince you to go back. It will tell you that maybe now, in time, they will understand. That maybe now is the time to make yourself heard. But don't fall into that trap, because every time you go back, you abandon yourself. Every time you try to fix what broke you, you break a little more of yourself. True healing begins when you choose your peace, even if it means not having the outcome you'd like. When you understand that others don't need to acknowledge your pain for you to acknowledge and embrace it. When you realize that you don't need to be seen to exist, that it's enough to see yourself. And seeing yourself truthfully is what scares most those who always saw you as fragile. There is a kind of strength that doesn't shout, that doesn't confront, that doesn't justify itself. It's the kind that simply withdraws, that chooses silence not out of weakness, but out of emotional intelligence. Because it has learned that not all noise is dialogue, and not all answers are healing. Sometimes true growth happens when you shut up and listen to yourself. You don't need to forgive now. You don't need to forget. You don't need to understand. You just need to respect your time and decide that from now on, your energy will be invested in yourself, not in ghosts. Your story doesn't deserve any more chapters written with the blood spilled by others. Stop living trying to make sense of what was done to confuse you. From here on, you'll want to go back. You'll miss it. You'll wonder if you overdid it, if you were too radical. But when that happens, stop and remember. Every time you wanted less, you lost yourself. Every time you tried to talk, beg, explain, you came out smaller. Now you grow, now you walk. And in the end, it's not about revenge. It never was. It's about maturity, about emotional intelligence, about understanding that you don't need someone else's downfall to get back up, that you don't need someone else's pain to heal yours, that you can finally close this cycle gracefully, without shouting, without drama, without making a scene. You simply choose to stop dancing to the music they played. You choose to leave the stage. You choose to return to yourself. And this return is the greatest revolution you've ever made. But there's something almost no one talks about. What to do with longing. What to do with the emptiness. What to do with the desire to return even knowing it will hurt. That's what we'll talk about next. There comes a point in your journey when you no longer want to scream. You no longer want to justify, prove, or be understood. You just want silence. Not empty silence, but the silence that comes after the storm. The kind that doesn't mean absence, but presence. A kind of presence that only those who have been broken understand. You reach a point where you realize that peace isn't a prize the world hands you. It's a choice you make silently, every day. But this choice isn't easy. Because somewhere inside you, you still harbor the idea that being strong means confronting others. That if you remain silent, you'll appear weak. You'll appear like you've lost. And if there's one thing the ego hates, it's appearing small. But here's an uncomfortable truth. True power isn't in defeating others. It's in no longer needing to defeat them. And few people understand this. You can spend your entire life trying to be heard, trying to show that you were unfairly hurt. You can write letters, messages, and vent. You can beg for a conversation, wait for an apology. But the more you do this, the more you give away your power, because you continue to believe that your peace depends on the other person acknowledging what they did. And it doesn't. But how do you maintain this state of lucidity when everything around you seems to pull you back into chaos? How do you sustain inner silence when your mind insists on creating noise? The answer isn't absolute control. It's the repeated choice not to react. You don't need to overcome your thoughts. You just need to not follow them. Freedom isn't in not feeling, but in not getting lost in what you feel. Have you ever noticed how some people seem to live in constant turmoil, even when everything is calm, as if the noise were inside them? This happens because we often confuse peace with boredom. We confuse tranquility with a lack of purpose. But true peace isn't apathy. It's lucidity. It's knowing you can react, but choosing not to because it's no longer worth it. And here's a pattern break that needs to be said. Not every emotion needs a response. Not every provocation deserves a stage. Not every thought should be followed through to completion. Emotional maturity begins when you understand that your attention is what gives life to things. If you fuel conflict, it grows. If you fuel absence, it dissolves. But why is it so difficult to practice this in everyday life? Because we've been taught that silence is consent, that turning away is flight, that not responding is wrong. We've been conditioned to believe we need to react to exist, and this is a trap. Because the more you react, the more you connect to what hurts you, the more you cling to what should be kept at bay. Now imagine someone who decides to walk away, someone who no longer responds, who doesn't confront, who doesn't fight back. In the eyes of others, this may seem like weakness, but inside, this person is building their most powerful armor: peace. A peace that doesn't depend on the opinions of others. A peace that protects itself with clarity and sustains itself with awareness. This is true strength. The strength that doesn't shout, that doesn't perform, that doesn't need validation. But what happens when this peace is tested? When someone provokes you, challenges you, tries to bring back your old self? Do you give in or stay? Do Do you react or observe? True transformation begins when you realize you no longer need to enter every battle you're invited to. When you understand that your energy is a sacred resource and that not everything deserves investment. Have you ever thought about how much of your life was spent trying to prove things to people who didn't care? How many hours did you spend imagining answers, dialogues, and justifications? What if you had used that time to care for yourself, to grow, study, or rest? What would have changed? What would have blossomed? Perhaps you're right now in that very moment of transition, with one foot in the past and the other trying to move forward. But something still pulls you. Something inside you still believes you need closure, recognition. And herein lies the trap. That recognition may never come. And if it does, it may no longer mean anything. Because true healing isn't being recognized by others. It's not needing it anymore. Sometimes the greatest victory is not reacting. Not because you've lost your fire, but because you've learned to channel it. Not because you've become apathetic, but because you've realized that not every fire deserves your oxygen. You start choosing. You start observing. You start selecting what deserves your presence. And that changes everything. Now think, what if your silence is more powerful than any answer? What if your absence is more impactful than any confrontation? What if your indifference is what finally breaks the cycle? You don't need to shout to be heard. Just be so clear in your conduct that the noise no longer reaches you. And then something magical happens. You begin to live. Not just exist. Not just survive emotionally, but live with presence, with purpose, with discernment. You begin to occupy your own life, to build your own spaces, and you realize that much of what you called love was actually neediness. That much of what you called connection was emotional dependence. This awareness doesn't come from books. It comes from pain. It comes from the process. It comes from the daily decision not to repeat the same patterns. Seneca said that the soul needs to be trained as one trains the body, with discipline, with patience, with constancy. And that's what you're doing now. Even if you still feel lost, you're training yourself not to return to where you were hurt, not to respond where there's no listening, not to give your best to those who only came to consume. You're learning in practice that silence is also a language, and that often it says what no words could express. But does the other person realize this? Does the person who hurt you understand what you're building now? The answer is simple. It doesn't matter. Because this process isn't about them. It's about you. About your reconstruction. About your journey back to yourself. And those who don't understand this no longer need to be part of the journey. From now on, the challenge is not to forget. It's to no longer hold on. No longer feed. No longer invest in the illusion that one day things will be different with those who have already shown you who they are. Peace is not the absence of pain, it is the presence of awareness. And the more aware you become, the harder it is to return to places where you lost yourself. Have you ever stopped to think that your biggest mistake was insisting on making it work with someone who didn't want the same? That your effort was one-sided? That your love wasn't shared, just taken advantage of? What if all of this wasn't rejection, but redirection? What if the universe wasn't punishing you, but protecting you? These questions don't have ready-made answers, and that's why they're powerful. Because they lift you from the surface. They force you to dive, to search, to reflect, to reinvent yourself. And in that dive, you begin to understand that growing hurts. But stagnating, that's true suffering. You no longer need to carry burdens that aren't yours. You no longer need to meet expectations that were never yours. Your life is a temple, and not everyone should enter. Your peace is a sanctuary, and it shouldn't be desecrated by any presence. Start choosing better. Start prioritizing your presence, because you're the only one who knows what it took to get here. In the end, what scares those who lost you most isn't your silence. It's your peace. It's realizing that you no longer need them, that you no longer suffer, that you've stopped fighting for something that in fact was never yours. Absence in this case isn't emptiness. It's the presence of self-love. And when you begin to walk with this presence, something in you changes forever. You no longer beg. You no longer chase. You no longer explain yourself. You simply follow. And whoever wants to accompany you will need to walk at the same pace, with respect, with truth, with reciprocity. But perhaps one question still remains. How can we sustain this peace in a world that seems to fuel conflict? How can we protect our balance when everything around us seems to want to steal our attention? That's what we'll talk about next. Some people will never know the value of your presence until they completely lose access to it. And even then, when that happens, many don't even realize what they've truly lost. Not because you were worthless, but because they never knew how to look at you with eyes that see. That's not your fault. It's their limitation. But the most dangerous thing about this is what you do with this neglect. You turn it into a mirror. You begin to believe you're invisible, that you're worthless, that you're disposable. And that's when you lose yourself. Boundaries aren't walls that keep people apart. They're gates that protect. Only those you authorize, those who show respect, who know how to remain harmless, enter. And why is it so difficult to create these boundaries? Because we're afraid of appearing cold, selfish, or insensitive. But think about it. What's crueler, setting a boundary to protect your peace or continuing to allow pain to recur in the name of kindness? There's a fact almost no one knows. According to emotional psychology research, more than 60% of relapses in abusive relationships occur because the injured person has difficulty establishing and maintaining clear emotional boundaries. It's not for lack of strength. It's due to an excess of misdirected empathy, a belief that there's still something to save where there's only repetition. Have you ever found yourself trying to stay in a relationship just because you thought there was still potential? Because deep down you believed the person was better than their actions? Because you remembered the good times and thought they were the truth, while the rest was just a phase? This is the most subtle poison. Distorted hope. Hope without reciprocity is a trap. Expecting someone to change when they don't even see a problem with who they are is a pact of silent suffering. And what do most people do? Lower their voices, adapt, tolerate, to the point where they no longer know who they were before they entered this cycle. Have you ever stopped to think about why it's so hard to say no? Not just to others, but to yourself. Saying no to neediness, no to repetition, no to the urge to return. Perhaps because we were taught to please, to keep the peace, to be kind. But being kind without limits is food for those who feed on carelessness. Being kind without boundaries is being swallowed up by the need to please until you disappear. And then comes the key point. You don't need to explain your limit or justify it or apologize. Your experience is your proof. What you've lived through is argument enough. Anyone who truly wants to stay will understand. Those who question your limit probably benefited from your lack of protection. How many times have you said yes when you meant no? How many times have you given in, stayed, listened, tolerated, just to avoid causing discomfort? And what has this brought you? Exhaustion, confusion, emotional fatigue. Boundaries aren't coldness. They're caring. They're saying, I respect myself, even if that results in silence from the other person. There's a true story circulating in some emotional trauma clinics. A woman, after years in relationships that undermined her self-esteem, decided to create a ritual. Whenever she felt like giving in, she wrote a letter to herself explaining why she didn't deserve to go through that again. She kept the letters. A year later, she read them all, and she cried. Not because she wanted to go back, but because she realized how much she had abandoned herself to keep others close. This is common, more common than it seems. Seneca taught that the soul, when repeatedly invaded, becomes fragile, vulnerable to the slightest sign of intrusion. But the opposite is also true. The more you honor your limits, the stronger your soul becomes. And this begins with small decisions. By not responding to that message you know will lead. By not accepting invitations that carry the same standards. By not justifying your silence to those who have never heard your cry. Perhaps you're at that threshold now, a transition point between pain and clarity. You still feel something, but you see too much to go back. And that, in itself, is a sign of evolution. The pain may still exist, but now it doesn't command. It informs, it shows, and you begin to choose more consciously. But why, even so, do you feel guilty about setting boundaries? Because the other person has learned to benefit from your guilt. And every time you try to walk away, they activate this trigger. With phrases, with absence, with manipulation. Guilt isn't real, it's taught, and it can be unlearned. You're not bad for protecting yourself, you're responsible. Now imagine that your peace is a house. Every time you let someone in without taking off their shoes, you dirty the floor that took years to clean. Every time you allow an invasion, you have to rebuild what was shaken. There comes a time when you understand. It's not about controlling the other, but about controlling access. You can love and still say, it's not enough. You can have beautiful memories and still decide not to go back. You can care and still keep your distance. A boundary isn't an absence of love, it's self-love. And the world needs to start understanding that. There's a surprising statistic that shows that 8 out of 10 people who grow most emotionally in the 2 years following a major breakup are those who, even through pain, firmly maintain their boundaries. Because boundaries are the soil where true self-esteem grows. There is no self-love without boundaries. Have you ever noticed that when you finally set a limit, some people just disappear? They didn't leave because you changed. They left because you were no longer convenient. And this is a natural filter. The pain of the initial loss is soon replaced by the lightness of no longer carrying the weight of constant adaptation. Maybe you're experiencing exactly that right now. The emptiness of the aftermath, the noisy absence. But here's a comforting truth. The initial emptiness is the space where your new life will be born. It's the gap between what you were and what you're becoming. And in that space, you need to remain. Even when you feel like going back. Even when it feels lonely. Have you ever stopped to think that the fear of loneliness is what keeps us most tied to relationships that have already ended emotionally? That you've often preferred the familiar pain to the unknown of freedom? But freedom doesn't hurt. What hurts is the attachment to the past. And the more you accept this fear, the more strength you gain to overcome it. The truth is, you will survive. You will flourish. You will laugh again. You will trust again. But only if you stop allowing the same cycle to continue to reel you in with sweet words and empty actions. Your time is sacred. Your mind is sacred. Your energy is a valuable resource. Stop wasting it on what drains you. Now you might be thinking, but what if I'm being radical? This question comes from the part of you that still wants to be accepted, that still hopes for recognition. But remember, those who truly love you respect your boundaries, and those who don't never loved you. They just used you emotionally. Could it have been unconscious? Maybe, but it was still real. And what do you do with it now? Create a new internal rule. Only those who understand the value of your presence remain. Only those who know how to handle your silence without forcing explanations remain. Only those who don't try to manipulate your feelings to gain access to what no longer deserves to be touched remain. You're not hard to love. You're just learning not to accept any kind of love. Love that hurts isn't love. It's attachment. It's trauma. It's repetition. True love never makes you doubt your worth. It never puts you in constant doubt. It never forces you to choose between yourself and another. From now on, everything changes. But not because the world will understand your pain, but because you'll stop trying to explain it to those who never wanted to listen. You'll stop proving, justifying, and softening. You'll simply keep the gate closed. And whoever has the right key, respect, care, presence, will enter naturally. But perhaps one last question remains. How to maintain this limit when the heart still insists on opening? How to keep the door closed when need hits hard? That's what we'll talk about next. There comes a moment when you realize that forgiveness is no longer a choice made for the other. It's a liberation made for yourself. An intimate, invisible act without applause. There's no scene of reconciliation, no final embrace. There's just you looking inward, recognizing that you've carried too much weight, and that continuing to carry it is a slow form of self-destruction. Because forgiveness, contrary to what many think, is not a gesture of weakness. It's a declaration of sovereignty. Forgiving isn't forgetting. It's not validating. It's not accepting. It's simply refusing to continue being the emotional extension of the person who hurt you. It's stopping carrying that person around in your mind as if they still had some kind of power. And that's where the breakthrough lies. When you understand that moving on doesn't mean what they did was fair. It means you've stopped punishing yourself for something you didn't cause. Seneca, in his most intimate meditations, said that resentment is the poison one drinks while waiting for the other to die. This metaphor has never been more true than today. We live trapped in mental replays of past hurts, reliving scenes, reimagining dialogues, placing ourselves at the center of tribunals that exist only within our heads. And with each repetition, we weaken further. You may have been betrayed, humiliated, ignored. You may have been treated as an option by someone you prioritized. You may have given your all, and yet, you received no recognition whatsoever. The pain of this is real, but what you do with that pain is what changes everything. You can let it define your behavior, or you can use it to redefine your presence in the world. There's a kind of emotional imprisonment that's silent. It doesn't show up in your words, but in your reactions, in how you close your heart, in how you become colder, more skeptical, more defensive. You think you're protecting yourself, but you're only allowing the pain to continue shaping you. Forgiveness is the tool that breaks this chain. It doesn't change what happened, but it changes what continues to happen inside you. You might think you'll only be able to forgive when the person apologizes, but this weight is a trap, because it binds your freedom to someone's repentance that may never come. And even if it does, it may mean nothing, because true forgiveness happens when you no longer need the other person to understand. You only need to understand what caused it, what it taught you, and where it ends. There's a famous case in psychology of a patient who spent 20 years waiting for an apology from her father for having been emotionally abandoned as a child. She lived 2 decades in toxic relationships, carrying the feeling of being unlovable. When she finally confronted her father, he coldly responded, "I did what I thought was best." There was no repentance. There was no healing from him. But in that moment, she realized that the apology would never come, and that she could still be free. That's the point. Forgiveness is yours. It doesn't depend on the other person. It's a key you hold, a key that unlocks the cell you've locked yourself in. And the reason so many people don't forgive isn't because they can't, it's because they believe forgiveness is validation. But you can forgive and keep your distance. You can forgive and never allow contact again. You can forgive and still say, "I don't want you in my life anymore." This clarity is frightening, because we've been conditioned to believe that forgiveness is reconciliation. But it isn't. Forgiveness is cutting the invisible thread that still connects you to the person who hurt you. It's freeing your mind from the constant presence of someone who's gone. It's ceasing to consult the past to authorize the present. And it's, above all, an act of self-care. You might even think, "But I can't forget." And that's okay. Forgiveness doesn't require forgetting. It requires awareness. It's knowing exactly what was done, and still deciding that it will no longer define who you are. That pain will no longer shape your relationships. That episode will no longer be the lens through which you see the world. Maybe right now, in this moment, you still feel angry, and that anger is justified, because what they did to you wasn't small, because you didn't deserve it. But what will you do with that anger? Will you let it consume your energy? Will it dictate your actions? Or will you turn it into fuel to rebuild yourself? The choice is yours. It always has been. Seneca said that the greatest freedom is inner freedom, the kind that doesn't depend on anyone else, the kind that no one can take away. And forgiveness is one of the paths to this freedom, because it cuts the invisible bonds that still bind you. Bonds made of recurring thoughts, unresolved memories, imagined conversations. You might be thinking, "But how will I know if I've truly forgiven?" The answer is simple. When you can think of the person and no longer feel the weight of it. When the memory is there, but it doesn't hurt. When the name doesn't trigger negative emotions. When you feel like you could move on with your life even if the other person never acknowledges what they did. But be careful. Just because you've forgiven doesn't mean the pain was small, quite the opposite. Generally, the deeper the cut, the more necessary forgiveness is. Because the more you resist, the wider the cut opens. Forgiveness doesn't close the wound. It allows it to heal. And contrary to what they say, forgiving isn't an act of kindness. It's an act of emotional intelligence. Because holding on to resentment consumes you. Because resentment ages the soul. Because living trapped by what was done to you is holding your peace hostage. You no longer need to live in the past. You no longer need to carry others on your shoulders. They don't deserve that space. Have you ever noticed that the moments you felt most free were those when you stopped expecting something, when you stopped insisting on an answer, when you stopped begging for understanding? These are the moments when you tap into your own sovereignty. And that's what forgiveness is. Stopping begging for peace and starting to build it within yourself. You may never get what you deserve. There may never be justice. But what you can build from this is still sacred. And if you still don't know how to forgive, start small. Start by accepting that the pain existed, that what they did hurt, that it was real, and that, even so, you choose not to live with it anymore. It's not about being superior. It's about being free. It's not about forgetting. It's about stopping carrying. You're not doing this for them. You're doing it for yourself. Because you owe yourself this lightness. Because you deserve to sleep without replaying conversations. Because your mind needs space for new things. You've bled too much for old stories. You've bowed too much for people who never even looked you in the eye. You've given too many explanations to those who never cared to listen. Now it's time to choose yourself, to heal, to free yourself. And the first step to that freedom is forgiveness. A forgiveness that asks for nothing, that expects nothing, that simply says, I free myself, and that's enough. But what happens after forgiveness? What happens when you finally let go? When there's no one left to blame? When peace arrives? That's what we'll talk about next. There comes a point in your journey when there's no one left to blame. No excuse to repeat old patterns. No external face to justify what's happening inside you. It's at that point that everything changes. Because at that point, finally, you understand that true transformation was never about the other. It was always about you. About how you react, about what you decide to do with everything you've experienced. It's when you stop looking for someone to blame and start looking for direction. Not the direction of the paths out there, but the silent path that leads within. It's no longer about revenge, nor about response, nor about justice. It's about transcendence, about becoming someone who no longer fits into the narrative of pain, someone who looks back with compassion but not with longing. Someone who feels gratitude for having survived, not resentment for having suffered. Someone who no longer needs to prove anything, because they finally understood that being whole doesn't require an audience. It doesn't require applause, nor recognition. It only requires the courage to keep going, even when everything seems to want to stop you. You've walked through difficult memories. You've felt the weight of absence, the silence of indifference, the frustration of non-reciprocity, and yet, you're here, still standing, still feeling, still wanting to evolve. This is already a daily miracle, because there's a silent strength that arises when you choose to continue, even without answers, even without recognition. This strength doesn't shout, it doesn't flaunt itself. It settles in slowly, like someone learning to breathe amidst the wreckage. But what now? What do you do with all this? With everything you've learned? With everything you've felt? The answer is both simple and complex. You build. You pick up the rubble of what's left and calmly begin to build something new. Something that no longer depends on the gaze of others, but on your own self-perception. Something that grows like a seed forgotten in the soil, unhurriedly, but with a destiny. It starts with small rituals, simple yet powerful. Waking up and choosing silence over noise. Taking a deep breath before responding. Observing your own thoughts like you would a child, without judging, but also without blindly obeying. Replacing "why did this happen to me?" with "what can I do about this now?" Realizing that you have much more control than you imagined, not over others, but over your own choices. You don't need a revolution. You need an internal movement that's constant, even if subtle. Something only you notice, but that transforms everything. This could be a new habit, a new routine, an honest conversation with yourself, the decision to not accept less than you deserve, the courage to say no even when you're afraid, the choice to be alone even when you miss someone, and perhaps most importantly, the silent commitment to never abandon yourself again. Don't expect from the world what you haven't yet learned to give yourself. Peace, respect, space, affection. It all starts within. Because if you don't prioritize yourself, you'll always be trying to fit in where there's no room for your whole soul. And each failed attempt only reaffirms the false idea that you don't deserve it. But you do. You always have. Seneca said that life isn't short, it's poorly lived. And part of this poor experience comes from unconscious repetition, from repeating wounds, from repeating stories, from repeating behaviors we already know will lead to. And yet we return, out of fear, out of habit, out of emptiness. But now, you know. Now, you can no longer pretend you don't understand. And knowing, even if it hurts, is the first step toward liberation. You hold the key, it's in your hands. The key to boundaries, the key to silence, the key to distance, the key to starting over. And none of these doors will open if you keep waiting for the other person to change, for the other person to come back, for the other person to understand. Now it's up to you, only you. And that's the scariest, and at the same time, the most liberating news you could ever receive. And here's a simple, straightforward, and strategic action plan to start now. 1. Create a space of your own. It can be a physical location or a time during the day when you disconnect from everything to reconnect with yourself. 2. Write. Every day. A line, a paragraph. What you felt, what you thought, what you decided. This isn't for others, it's to organize your inner chaos. 3. Set 3 non-negotiable boundaries. This could include not responding to messages from people who hurt you, not justifying your decisions to those who don't respect your pain, and not beating yourself up for saying no. 4. Cultivate silence. Not the silence of escape, but the silence of introspection. A moment without noise, without screens, without distractions. 10 minutes a day makes a difference. 5. Evaluate your connections. Make a list of the people who lift you up and those who drain your energy. Decide courageously where to invest. 6. Rewrite your narratives. Take an old pain and reinterpret it. Replace blame with a lesson. Replace resentment with clarity. Do this weekly. 7. Reinforce your identity. Every day remind yourself of who you want to become, and act as if you already are that version, even in silence, even alone. 8. Learn something new. A course, a reading, a piece of knowledge that takes you out of the cycle of repetition. 9. Nourish your body with care. Eat what nourishes you. Sleep what renews you. Move with respect. 10. Observe your inner dialogue. Correct yourself when you're being your own aggressor. Replace self-criticism with self-accountability. None of this requires money, nor approval. It just requires decision. A silent choice that you repeat until the new becomes natural. And the more you do this, the less room there will be for what once hurt you. You'll realize that what once brought you down now only bothers you. And afterward, not even that. You can. Not because the world will applaud you, but because you deserve to breathe without fear, to walk without explaining yourself, to love without abandoning yourself, to sleep without carrying the weight of stories that should have already ended. You deserve to feel peace not as an exception, but as a natural state. And if at any point it all seems too much, remember, you're not alone. Other people are on this journey too. They're also relearning how to listen to themselves, how to respect themselves, how to protect themselves. Sharing this journey isn't weakness, it's humanity. It's recognizing that growth can also be a collective act, even in silence. So if this video touched you in any way, if any part of this message resonated with you, leave a comment here, even if it's anonymous. Share your story, your doubts, your experience. Your pain can help someone else recognize themselves. Your overcoming can be the strength someone needs to not give up. And if this content resonated with you, consider subscribing to the Deep Psyche channel. Like this video and share it with someone who needs to hear it, not just as a gesture of support for the channel, but as a gesture of support for yourself. Because when you share healing, you heal yourself. Because in the end, it's not about likes, it's about awakening. And every time you share content like this, you plant a seed of awareness in a world that, more than ever, needs awakened souls. Souls that no longer pretend to sleep. Souls that are no longer afraid to shine, even when no one is looking. The journey continues, and you are ready. You no longer need to prove anything. Just live what you have finally begun to understand. Your peace is your revolution. Your absence is your answer. And your silent reconstruction is your loudest cry.